Good afternoon. Welcome to the CDP webinar, COVID-19, How Philanthropy Can Stand Up for Vulnerable Communities. This is Sally Ray, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. This webinar is presented in partnership with the Humana Foundation and is co-sponsored by Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, the Council on Foundations, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, Grantmakers in Health, Grantmakers in Aging, United Philanthropy Forum, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. Some reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available along with recordings from past webinars on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. All registrants will be sent a link to the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We will get to as many as possible at the end of the panel presentation. Questions that are not addressed will be answered in a follow-up document that will be available on this webinar's page on our website. If you are on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. This webinar will address the CARES Act and government stimulus funding, the limitations of governmental responses, how philanthropists can act directly and act as advocates for better protections for at-risk populations, approaches for developing a public policy agenda for philanthropy based in equity. CDP recently awarded its fourth round of grant making from our COVID-19 Response Fund. In this round, we provided grants to 9 additional organizations for a total of more than $2.3 million to Action Aid and the Feminist Humanitarian Network, BRAC, Catholic Relief Services, Child Care Aware, Emergent Fund, Norwegian Refugee Council, Points of Light Foundation, Restaurant Workers Community Foundation, and World Central Kitchen. We've now awarded grants totaling more than $7 million to 30 organizations to support the global response to this pandemic. And we are already working with more nonprofit organizations on plans for a 5th round of grant making to respond to immediate needs and to begin to plan for recovery from the effects of the virus on domestic and international communities. Now I would like to introduce our guest. Aaron Dorfman is President and CEO of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, a research and advocacy organization that works to ensure America's grantmakers and wealthy donors are responsive to the needs of those with the least wealth, opportunity, and power. Aaron frequently speaks and writes about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in philanthropy, the benefits of funding advocacy and community organizing, and the need for greater accountability and transparency in the philanthropic sector. Ruth Madrigal is a principal at KPMG LLP and is the leader of the Exempt Organizations Group in the firm's Washington National Tax Practice. She has extensive experience both within the government and in private practice, advising on a wide variety of legal and tax policy issues affecting charities and other tax-exempt entities. Ruth previously was in private practice in law firms, advising a broad range of exempt organizations, their donors, businesses, and individuals on such areas as charitable giving, social impact activities, impact investing, and investments in qualified opportunity zones. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for taking time away from your work to speak with us today. Ruth, we'll start with you. What are the trends you're seeing in the tax-exempt sector?
Sorry, I was just unmuting my phone, the challenges of technology. So trends that I am seeing include things that we're all seeing across the economy generally. I mean, tax exempts, just like every other employer, are having the challenges, meeting the challenges of operating during the pandemic, including the shutdown of offices and the difficulty in doing our everyday operations. We've got employees that have been affected by the by the disease and operations that are affected by government orders and social distancing. And so we are grappling with all of those business interruption things, the reductions in revenues, the cash flow shortages that all other employers and operating entities have to grapple with. But another trend that I think that the for-profits really aren't grappling with in the same way is the increase in demand. In a number of for-profit organizations, you have decreased receipts because there is decreased demand for services and products. And in our operating environment, that link is not the same, and you've got an increase in demand for services as folks in the for-profit economy are being laid off and are having financial difficulties and experiencing needs, health needs, economic needs, needs of communities that our institutions are really there to serve. So I think we're seeing both an increase in demand and a decrease in resources to meet that demand.
Ruth, what is in the stimulus packages that supports nonprofits and at-risk communities, if there's anything?
There is. There are a number of provisions that are available for not-for-profit organizations as well as their for-profit counterparts. To begin with, I'll just kind of think chronologically. One of the first pieces of legislation that came out, the Phase 2 COVID relief legislation, put in place new emergency paid sick leave and expanded Family Medical Leave Act provisions. And those provisions provided that for smaller employers, those with less than 500 employees, including not-for-profit organizations, they would have to provide certain amounts of leave, paid leave for their employees that are impacted by the pandemic. Either they're sick themselves, or due to school closures, their children are home or their child care providers are not around, so that they have to miss work because of caring for family members. And so this piece of legislation provided for paid leave for folks and also provided a tax credit for 100% of that as a tax credit against the employer portion of Social Security taxes. So it's available both for not-for-profits and for-profits. And then moving forward to the CARES Act, there were a number of provisions in the CARES Act that were meant to address the cash flow problems and issues that all employers are facing as people are not able to work, and yet you still want to keep them on payrolls and keep them in health insurance, which in the way we do things here is often tied to employment. So the CARES Act provided for payroll tax deferral for a period of time for employers on that employer portion of the Social Security tax. Instead of paying it on an ongoing basis, the timely basis, there is this provision allows employers to defer the payment until the end of 2021 for half of it and the end of 2022 for the other half of it. So instead of making the payment this month, can wait and pay half of it at the end of 21 and 22, and that amounts to an interest-free loan of the amount of money that you would otherwise be depositing for taxes. You'll have to pay it eventually, but in the meantime, you can use it to meet other operating costs. Another provision, set of provisions out there were specifically tied to trying to keep employees on the payroll even when there wasn't work to be done. So the Small Business Administration's Payroll Protection Program is a loan that at a low interest rate that becomes forgivable when it's used for payroll costs. Another program, the Employee Retention Credit, that's a tax-based program that allows eligible employers that have had a suspension of some portion of their activity or a drop in gross receipts of more than 50%. If those eligible employers are still paying employees that can't provide services, then they can get a 50% credit for the amount of qualifying wages, those being the wages that are paid despite the fact that the person is not performing services, and the amount of the qualified health benefits that they are paying. So even if an employer needs to furlough employees, they can keep paying the health insurance costs and get a credit for half of that amount, 50% of that amount, if they're an eligible employer. And then finally, there are other loan programs through the SBA, through Treasury, that are being set up. They had nonprofits in mind. Some of those have not been expanded all the way to nonprofits yet, but they're thinking about how to do those loan programs specifically for nonprofits. And there are some other funding programs administered through folks like the HHS or the Department of Education or FEMA, aimed at particular pieces of the sector, like hospitals or universities or relief organizations. So those are some of the provisions that are out there.
What concerns do you have about how the tax-exempt sector will be affected, Ruth?
Well, a lot of concerns. Without resources, it's going to be difficult to continue to both keep our operations going, so on a micro level, to take care of the employees and those who work in the sector, but then also on the more macro level to take care of the beneficiaries and the folks that we serve. The needs are great now and are going to continue to be great. We've got the medical emergency that was recognized in March, that we're dealing with the medical emergency, and then we've got a financial crisis coming right on its heels. And I think that there's a real lack of understanding about how the tax-exempt sector functions and finances the work that it does. And so in the wake of some of the stimulus packages that have offered assistance to businesses and nonprofits, there's been a real sort of a critical eye taken to all organizations that are accessing that stimulus funding and the assistance. But I think that some of the recent news reports show a real lack of understanding about the way the sector functions and fiscally is set up, a real skepticism of endowments, a real taking issue with organizations that have wealthy board members, perhaps accessing some of these funds. So I think there are some additional barriers for tax-exempt organizations that are trying to access the stimulus helps in order to help their beneficiaries, because there's a lack of understanding about what is normal and what resources that the sector has.
What did you see in the 2008 recession that might be repeated, and what could philanthropy be doing differently to help nonprofits?
Yeah, I think, 2008 felt like it was a once-in-a-lifetime situation financially, and I think that sometimes I've been thinking now that that was just the warm-up, and that was sort of preparing us for now. In that, when 2008 happened, I think we saw a drop in resources immediately. The sector felt it, very drops in contributions from individuals. The drop in endowments meant that there was a drop in grant funding that was available. There was a drop in governmental funding as governmental budgets were hit, and they didn't have the liquidity that was in short supply everywhere. And I think we're probably going to see the same thing this time around. And it's going to put a real premium on thinking about how do we get the biggest bang out of our bucks. We're always looking for that, of course, but when the resources are tight, I think that really puts upon us the imperative to think about how we do things and how can we do them differently and better. And in the wake of 2008, one of the things that we worked on diligently when I was at Treasury was to look at other models of impact investing, for example. Program-related investments have been with us forever as private foundations, but were a very, very little used tool. And so in the wake of 2008, we looked at how loans, loan guarantees can help leverage dollars in the sector from the private sector, can help match the need for the cash assistance. Maybe it's a short-term cash flow need, and they don't need, the grantee may not need the funding forever, but may need it only for a 1 year or 2 year period. And by matching the tool for funding with the need for funding, might be able to better allocate the resources that are very scarce. And so I think that some of the things we learned in doing the guidance that opens up program-related investing and mission-related investing to as additional tools in the toolkit for how to match resources and needs. I think we can look at that in the coming months and see if there are some tools that we could use going forward.
Thank you, Ruth. A lot to think about there. Erin, we're going to go to you next, but before we do, just a reminder that listeners can put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering them a little later. Erin, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy works to encourage philanthropy to do more for those who are marginalized, underserved, and disenfranchised. What do you think philanthropy should be doing differently now in light of the COVID-19 pandemic to support those populations?
Well, Sally, thanks for having me on, and thanks to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for all you've been doing to help our nation and the world get through this crisis. There's really 4 things I want to lift up on how philanthropy can do things differently now in light of this pandemic. Number 1 is to put equity first. There has been a lot of talk about equity in philanthropy for the past 5-10 years. And now more than ever is the time for philanthropy to walk that talk and really do it. The current coronavirus pandemic is hitting workers and immigrants disproportionately hard. Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and people of color are facing the brunt of this crisis domestically. And we need funders to make sure that those hard-hit communities are getting prioritized in their philanthropic response. And so some people like to say, we're all in this together. And to some extent we are, but that doesn't mean that as a fund, your response grants should be targeted to try to benefit everyone. Because if you do that, you're likely to leave out the most vulnerable. And to reach those communities, you've got to be thoughtful and intentional about an equity response to your funding plan to make sure the dollars are getting to those communities that are hardest hit. And putting equity first also means funding advocacy and civic engagement among marginalized communities. Government's response to the crisis is many magnitudes larger than the resources at philanthropy's disposal. And we've got to fund advocacy and community organizing so that vulnerable populations can be adequately included in government's response. For just one example, many Black-owned small businesses were left out of the PPP loan program that Ruth talked about. And we need strong advocates to make sure that the government responses reach the most vulnerable as well. Second thing philanthropy can do differently is to give more. Even though the stock market is down, we need funders to increase their giving at this time. This is a crisis unlike any most of us have ever seen. And I've been pleased to see some funders doubling their grant making and more in the wake of this crisis. The Wallace Global Fund, Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, Libra Foundation have all done dramatic increases in their grant spending this year. And the Skoll Foundation quadrupled its funding this year from 50 million to 200 million in response to the crisis. So those are some great leaders that we've been looking to and are showing the way for the rest of us. And you know, during the Great Recession, as Ruth said, most funders pulled back, and we ran the numbers, and domestic giving was down 14% within a couple of years after the start of the 2008 financial crisis. So we can't have that happen again. Funders need to make the decision to spend more to make sure that their grantees make it through this crisis so that they can serve the communities and causes that they care about. Number three, funders need to be flexible. We need to convert project grants to general operating support and give grantees the flexibility they need to do what's necessary to benefit their communities. And I will say philanthropy's been quite good about this so far, in my estimation. More than 700 foundations have signed the sort of flexibility pledge that's on COF's website, Council on Foundations website. So philanthropy is doing a good job so far on being flexible with grantees, but you may need to eliminate deliverables or extend deadlines, all those kinds of things. And the fourth thing I really think philanthropy needs to do now is to move money quickly. I'm sure every nonprofit, every grantee who's on this webinar today has had a situation where a foundation takes 6 months to make a decision and then takes another 3 months after that before cutting the check. Most nonprofits don't have operating capital. They don't have reserves. We need philanthropy to make decisions more quickly in this moment and to get the money out the door and to the grantees so they can use it to serve communities.
Great suggestions. How can philanthropy giving support equity? How can philanthropic giving support equity and inclusion? Or how can funders deepen this work if it's an area they already invest in?
Yeah, there's a few things that I think funders can do that I want to talk about. Number one, prioritizing the visions and plans and hopes and dreams of people of color, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and others disproportionately affected by this pandemic. Sometimes donors and funders think that because they've got the money, they're smarter than the communities that they're trying to serve. And my experience is that that's not usually true. And so we need donors to really have faith in the visions of the communities that you're trying to help. Secondly, we need to see more funding for movements. You cannot have equity and inclusion if you aren't funding grassroots social movements so that the people who are directly affected can advocate on their own behalf. And that includes providing funding for 501c4 organizations if you or your institution have the flexibility to do that, as well as grants to 501c3 groups. But robust movements are how we're going to have equitable policy responses to this crisis, and philanthropy needs to fund those movements. Third, to really show commitment to equity and inclusion, you've got to eliminate those burdensome reporting requirements. When executive directors of small and mid-sized nonprofits, they do their grant applications and their reports usually from like 11 p.m. to 1 or 2 in the morning. They don't have enough staff to do it. It's often the ED who's doing it. So they do it themselves at odd hours. We don't need to be burning them out with unreasonable requirements. So to the extent that funders can eliminate those burdens, that will be a huge step towards equity. And finally, if you're a funder who's already committed to equity, it's imperative that you figure out how to invite your peers into that space as well, and or influence collaboratives that you're a part of. The number one thing research shows, the number one things that influences what funders do is their peers, their other funders. And so if you are a philanthropy that's committed to equity, help others that you relate to see that as well. And here's an interesting approach one foundation that I'm familiar with took with a collaborative they're a part of. They're a small family foundation that's really committed to equity. And they decided to become a part of the collaborative funder response in their community. And they did the minimum $50,000 buy-in to be part of the funder collaborative. And they did it, they wouldn't normally have done something like that, but they said, you know what, that gives us a vote, that gives us a voice in how this collaborative is gonna work, and we can bring the equity voice into that room so long as we have a seat at the table. And so, so that is another good way that you can influence collaboratives that you're part of to make sure that they're focused on equity.
Aaron, what are the different calls to action in CRP is supporting? And I'm thinking of this both in terms of government activities and philanthropy.
Yeah. So inside philanthropy, we have two calls that we are a part of. I helped orchestrate the joint statement from 9 national philanthropy serving organizations, us, the Council on Foundations, National Center for Family Philanthropy, GEO, and others, calling for increased giving. And so the hyperlink is there in the slide if you haven't seen that yet, but we're certainly endorsing that. And the other is that funder pledge for flexibility. That resides on the Council on Foundations website. Again, it's hyperlinked there from the slide, and more than 700 foundations have signed that so far. In terms of calls for a governmental response, we're actually having a webinar tomorrow to really look at that. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal will be on with us about moving a progressive agenda in this time of crisis. What are the things that we need from government? So I don't have all the answers yet, but I will have more answers perhaps after tomorrow. But let me just lift up 3 things that are, I think, need to be a part of government's further response. Number 1, we need more money for and an extended time periods for unemployment supports. It's clear that people are going to be out of work for quite some time, and the next recovery legislation needs to include more for unemployment. Number 2, full inclusion of immigrants. It's outrageous the extent to which immigrants have been written out of the stimulus and recovery legislation that has been passed so far. Immigrants are an important part of our community. Most of us were immigrants at one time, or our parents or grandparents were. There's no reason to be writing them out of the recovery legislation. And if the federal government won't do it, then states can take action like California has done and some other states to make sure that immigrants are cared for in this time of crisis as well. And number 3, I think the next recovery legislation must include support for states, for state governments. State governments are going to be really stretched thin in the coming months, and local government, state and local government, provide much of the safety net for vulnerable communities. And if they're broke, they can't do that. And so we need a federal response that moves money to the states as well.
Great. If you could look a year or 2 in the future, Aaron, how does the philanthropic landscape look different? And what are the first 2 or 3 concrete steps we need to do now to get there?
Yeah, well, let me say, I'll give you the hopeful view for what I hope philanthropy will look like in a year or 2. I don't know if it will. I'm not a futurist, but my hope is that philanthropy does a far better job a year or 2 from now in building power, sharing power, and wielding power in pursuit of equity and justice. For building power, we need to see more philanthropic support targeted for advocacy, community organizing, civic engagement, and social movements, the kinds of activities that help vulnerable communities build power. Sharing power, I think, is really important in this moment. This gets at funders recognizing they don't have all the answers, and they got to share power with grantees. You can share power with general operating support and multi-year grants, but many leading funders are also sharing power by putting representatives of the communities they hope to serve on the governing board of the foundation. And I think with all of the skepticism towards billionaires right now, if they want to see less skepticism about their philanthropy, a great way to counter that is to actually share power as you give this money away, so that it's not just the billionaires deciding what and how the public good should be served, but it's billionaires in partnership with a broader community making those decisions. It's really important. And finally, wielding power. I hope philanthropy will do a better job of wielding power on behalf of and in partnership with vulnerable communities. Foundations have a lot of reputational capital, and when they speak out, it makes a big difference. And sure, private foundations are barred from lobbying, but that doesn't mean that powerful trustees of those foundations, in their role as a private citizen, can't talk to the elected officials that they have relationships with and push an equity agenda with those folks. They just can't have the foundation staff prepare the resources for them to do that lobbying, but they can do it on their own. So we need to see more of that with philanthropy standing up for the most vulnerable in our communities and wielding their power in that way. In terms of steps to get there, there are a lot of ways. NCRP has 2 resources that I think can be helpful to funders. One is our Movement Investment Project. You see that there on the slide, and it's hyperlinked there. That really helps you understand the importance of funding movements and how to do it better. And then our Power Moves Toolkit is a self-assessment tool for foundations that actually care about equity. It's got all kinds of resources to help you build, share, and wield power effectively.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And we're going to move now in just a minute to questions from our audience. There were several questions about NGOs approaching funders and how to get on their radar. As the fund director for our COVID grants, I can share some ideas for NGOs. Many funds like ours at CDP operate on an invitation-only basis. It's important for NGOs to build relationships with foundations and program officers ahead of time whenever that's possible. When it's not possible, such as right now, do your research. Make sure the foundation or funder you want to approach funds the kind of work you are doing. See what else they are funding through their COVID work. Look to see whether there's an open call, and send a brief email introducing yourself, your program, your needs. If you do not do frontline disaster response, or in this case, support needs of people impacted by COVID, work with your existing funders and see if they can enhance your funding. And remember, many American philanthropies do not fund outside of the US, so international NGOs should look to organizations working in their communities to build partnerships and connections. Now, some of the questions from our audience. Let's see, here we have, Ruth, I'll send this one to you first, but then Aaron, I think you might have a good response too. What role should nonprofits have in public policy advocacy? We know business, banking, state, and local government, healthcare, et cetera, had strong voices in shaping CARES and other subsequent government response, but doesn't seem we had as loud a voice, and therefore not as many targeted programs to suit the nonprofit sector.
I would agree with that questioner, whoever that is. I agree. We don't have as strong a voice, and we have seen that nonprofits have not had their needs met in the same priority level as the for-profits. For example, just in the very most basic disaster relief provisions that sort of churn out of any administration always, when there's a disaster declaration, one of the first things that happens is a delay in the in filing due dates for tax forms. And the first one, the for-profit sector got their delay very quickly. Nonprofit sector did not have their delay in their 990 filing for weeks and weeks and weeks later, until there was finally a groundswell of demand for some of the same treatment. And I think there's a lack of understanding that tax-exempt organizations, they run organizations just like businesses do. They have employees, they have payroll to make, they have accounting and reporting requirements and other administrative needs, and they need the same sorts of relief that for-profit organizations need. They have the same needs for assistance with when receipts fall off. And I absolutely feel that tax-exempt organizations for a long time have not had the advocacy infrastructure to do what needs to be done. And in this particular, in the last couple of years, we have seen that deficit really come home. The 2017 Tax Act, I think, was a real wake-up call. And for a year prior to that, a number of us were saying, look, this is going to happen. This is coming down the pike. And a lot of organizations thought we'll be okay because we've always been okay. And we've always had our legislators and our folks have looked out for us. We haven't needed to have our own advocacy infrastructure. And when all was said and done, there were at least 4 new taxes on the tax-exempt sector that paid for the tax cuts for businesses. And at the time, I was with a law firm that had a government affairs practice, a very savvy government affairs practice. And what one of my partners there told me was, yeah, Ruth, you know what? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the tax-exempt sector was on the menu. And here again, we are having legislation passed to help specific parts of this sector. And we are seeing that the ones that have a seat at the table when these bills are crafted, and also when the regulations interpreting the bills are being drafted at Treasury and the IRS or in the other agencies, those organizations are getting the rules that are favorable to them and that help them. And so absolutely, I couldn't agree more with Aaron that tax-exempt organizations need to be involved in setting the rules for the tax-exempt sector, because the more administrative burden on the sector, the less resources available to serve the clients. And while the tax-exempt sector has been really good at advocacy work on behalf of clients in specific portions of the sector where the advocacy really directly impacts the beneficiaries, the fact of the matter is that all of these programs, to the extent that we don't get the same sorts of financial resources that for-profits are getting, and we have more administrative burdens, those are resources that do not go to our purpose and are not available. So I am fully supportive of philanthropy looking for ways that they can assist, they can't lobby directly, but there are exclusions in the tax rules for lobbying where it's self-defense lobbying, where it's lobbying for their own rules. And they can certainly give general purpose support grants to organizations who are then using some of that. It's not earmarked for it, it's not directed for it, but if they're giving general support grants to organizations that are doing some advocacy work, that's another way they're supporting some of the other activities that frees up dollars at the other end. So I agree.
Aaron, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I would just say, let's think about the scope to which we are outgunned and outnumbered on the Hill on this stuff. For every one person who is advocating on the Hill for public policies that are in the common good, the public interest, a public interest lobbyist, if you will, I bet we're outnumbered 1,000 to 1 or more by interests pursuing private interests on the Hill. And so, you know, nonprofits have to have more of a presence, and funders need to provide general support grants and not put lobbying exclusions in their grant agreements, you know, to get that done. We have power in relationship to decision makers if we can help them or hurt them in some way. And if we can't help them or we can't hurt them, then they're going to ignore us.
So Aaron, with that, what do you think are the most promising areas for philanthropy and governments to partner together on in order to address inequity in a way that wasn't being done prior to COVID-19? In other words, how do we get these systems to work together to address the needs of vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I mean, that can be done best in places where the government actually cares about those vulnerable communities. And I hate to be cynical about it, but a large number of our elected officials don't actually want to help vulnerable communities. And so part of it is about investing in civic engagement. So come November, December, perhaps we have a different set of actors making these kinds of decisions. But where there is a genuine interest, I think the partnerships have been done well when there is sort of a lead convener for the philanthropic and nonprofit sector who can be that link between funders and the government. Michigan has a liaison that I think has been quite effective in that role, who's housed at the Michigan Council on Foundations. And San Francisco has had a liaison in that way that's been quite effective. So I'd love to see more regional associations of grant makers investing in being that bridge between philanthropy and government. I think that can make the partnerships more effective.
Another one for you, Aaron. I'm sorry to be beating you up here a little bit. Is there an application model that you would recommend that facilitates easier access to philanthropic support for vulnerable populations? In other words, we spoke earlier about an invitation-only application process. Does that challenge access to traditionally vulnerable populations in your thinking?
Yeah, it often does. I mean, I think it is one of the troublesome trends in philanthropy over the last 20 years is the unwillingness of an increasing number of funders to accept unsolicited proposals. It's usually a bad thing. It usually boxes people out. Sometimes it can be done well if the program officers are really getting out there and getting to know potential new grantees in their service areas. But usually it's a challenge for vulnerable communities to get access to funders. And the applications, often they have review of applications by people who don't know the grantees who've submitted them. And, those who've gone to elite colleges may have an advantage in those kinds of application processes. So some of the funders who are most committed to ensuring that grassroots groups get the funding have gone to a system where they'll have a half-hour conversation or an hour-long conversation with the leader of the movement group, and then the program officer writes up their summary of the conversation as the application, shares it back with the grantee, who can say, yeah, that looks great. That's what we talked about. And so all the extra work was done by the foundation, and they can put it in the language that makes sense for others at their institution, and it takes the burden off of the movement groups. Some are doing allowing video applications as well for folks to talk about their work on video and submit that rather than lengthy, complicated written applications.
With that in mind, funding of movements and advocacy might be newer to some funders. And what do you think are best-in-class assessments or tools to determine a nonprofit's potential for success to inform investment priorities in these areas specifically? I'll open that to either one of you, whichever one feels most comfortable with that one.
So one of the things, I'll go first and Ruth chime in if you want to. One of the things we've learned over the years is that others in the community can have really good assessments of what their colleague organizations are doing and what their strengths are and what they bring to the table, especially if the funder is not creating a scarcity mentality, but rather wants to nurture an ecosystem of organizations. So, we did a lot of work in the South trying to increase philanthropic investments for equity in the South. And a lot of the urban Northeast funders have a certain view in their heads about what high capacity looks like. And they were judging these Southern nonprofits all wrong. They would say, oh, that group doesn't have the capacity, we can't give them a grant. Well, the truth was they did have capacity, but the capacity just looked different. And if the funder didn't really understand the community they were trying to fund in, they wouldn't see it. And so that's a really important step for funders to take if they want to invest in these groups. Now, there are cases where capacity doesn't exist, and funders have been successful in building the capacity of a cohort of nonprofits over a period of 5 or 10 years. You've got to be willing to stick with it for the long haul. But the Woods Fund in Chicago wanted to build the capacity of social change nonprofits on the south side of Chicago. And they invested for like 10 years in building these groups. And now there's a really strong set of nonprofits there that are getting a lot done. And that wouldn't have happened if the funder hadn't said, you know what, we're going to help these groups build their capacity and we're going to stick with them for the long term.
I'll just add, I mean, this is not really so different from problems that people face in their everyday world on the other side. Financially, you have to understand the business model of an organization in order to be able to appropriately invest, whether it's philanthropic investment or any other kind of investment. And the point that Aaron makes that, you know, if you're coming from a place that doesn't understand this whole area of investment, there may not be understanding. I think we see that problem in trying to get private capital, banks, to invest, loan money to tax-exempt organizations. And there has been historically a real problem in trying to draw that money into a sector because they just don't know how to underwrite those kinds of loans. We see that in there was a Main Street loan program that was part of the CARES Act, and the preamble to some FAQs that came out a couple of weeks ago said, here's the initial set of rules for how we're gonna open up this program. We're gonna let it's the medium-sized businesses, it's not the real small ones. We're gonna let the medium-sized businesses, and we're gonna start this with the for-profits. We know that there are nonprofits out there, they're doing good work, we wanna support them too, but we just don't know how to underwrite them. And it seems like it's the same sort of a problem. And I think it's compounded in our sector because oftentimes we are working in some of the communities that have very little resources. And so the organizations are going to look very, very different. The resources that they bring that make them investable, that make them successful, are not always the typical financial resources. You have resources in communities that are intangible resources that make programs successful. And so knowing about those community relationships and those community ties, or the human resources that are there, is every bit as important as knowing what's a bank balance for making that organization thrive and able to continue. I think that we as a sector oftentimes collaborate. We help each other to fill gaps more than what happens in the for-profit sector, and that we need to continue to do that. So folks that are familiar with how to do grant making, how to identify potential for success among Southern nonprofits, need to be helping to direct funds, and people can collaborate and rely on one another. I think that place-based philanthropy is often a successful way to identify what are the needs in this community and how can we maximize the impact without duplicating and coordinating the impact in this place. And similarly on particular issues. Maybe it's not a place-based type of a mission, but maybe it's an issue-based, and that by collaborating and coordinating with those who understand it well, we can be more effective.
Ruth, here's one specifically for you. You mentioned taking issue with organizations that have endowments and wealthy board members. Could you elaborate on what you're seeing as the impact on the sector and what you think can be done?
Sure. That came specifically with reference to a New York Times article a few weeks ago. The PPP loan program from the SBA has released reports of who's gotten loans as they've handed out tranches of those funds. And then different folks have looked into those lists and criticized large companies that are taking some of these funds that are available for smaller businesses, and also not-for-profits. There was an article a few weeks ago that criticized the Aspen Institute. And the basis for that criticism was that they had an endowment and they had wealthy board members, and therefore they were criticized for taking the PPP loan. And I looked at that and sort of shuddered with horror, because I think the fact that you have wealthy people on your board does not necessarily translate to a viable fiscal strategy for your organization. Just like wealthy people on the board of a for-profit company do not necessarily translate to that organization is fine. That's not the kind of system we live in, and there are distinctions between individuals and board members in the organizations. By the same token, endowments are not just big piles of cash that are sitting there available for use for any particular, it's not like it's excess profits that are sitting around that will just otherwise go into somebody's pocket. Oftentimes, endowments provide a base level of funding for an organization. That endowment of $1 million may provide the $40,000 of funding that they need to keep a base salary together. And so if you spend that endowment today, that means you don't have that program next year or the year after. And I think there's a lack of understanding about how endowments function in the charitable sector. And merely the fact that someone has an endowment does not mean they have necessarily the ability to spend it tomorrow. Number one, there's donor restrictions on it. So for example, colleges and universities, large portions of endowments have been set aside for particular purposes, i.e. to fund a chair in a particular discipline, the Mideast history for some minority population, or whatever it is, to ensure that that underrepresented view gets study and attention, not just this year, but next year and next year and the next year. Or for oftentimes things like financial aid for particular populations that don't have resources, so that those populations can have opportunities not just for 1 year, but for many years. And I think that this question about endowments and whether they're available to be spent or not, it's a complicated question that that needs to be really thought through, because if you, for example, double grant making, that might be the thing that an organization really needs to do to address their particular charitable purpose this year. But it comes at a cost of reduced ability to make grants in the future, unless you can guarantee some other source of funds in the future. And so I think organizations, their managers, and their grantees all need to be involved in a question about, is this particular purpose going to need funding now at the cost of funding later? Or do we foresee 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, a need for more funding then? And I mean, we all, there are resources and there's always going to be a limit. And I think we just really have to be thoughtful about how we utilize these both now and in the future.
Right, thank you. Erin, here's one for you. The exposure of the Latinx community in particular to COVID-19 has partly been tied to their participation in high-risk industries like meatpacking and food processing. What role can philanthropy play in the issue of workplace safety in these high-risk industries?
Yeah, worker power has been diminishing for 50 years in this country, and that is not by accident. The power of unions and working people is something that conservatives have targeted for a long time, and they've been pretty successful. And so, the long-term solution is to figure out how to rebalance the equation and give workers more power. And some funders are thinking about that. I was really pleased to see that the Omidyar network is putting up $35 million to help workers build power over the next few years. Others, well, this is a topic that Carmen Rojas, who is the incoming president of the Marguerite Casey Foundation, is going to address on our webinar tomorrow, in terms of how do we, in this moment, in this crisis, help workers be safe. Some of it is about putting guidelines and rules in place that employers have to follow, and then enforcing those rules and making sure, there are a lot of good labor rules on the books, some of which never get enforced. So we need good rules that protect workers, and we need enforcement of those rules. The sad fact is that, people are desperate for jobs and are often willing to put themselves at risk in order to feed their families. And, it's a shame that in this country we have to force people to make those choices. So ultimately, I think it's about building the political power of workers to negotiate better deals with employers.
Definitely, Aaron. Well, we're running out of time a little bit. We'll hope to get to answers to the rest of the great questions that are listed there in our follow-up to you. But as we begin to wrap up, I'd like to summarize some of the discussion and provide the audience with some key takeaways from our conversation today. Prioritize equity in your work. More stimulus funding is required to protect the most vulnerable. It is important to continue and expand stimulus packages to support nonprofits, individuals, and families. Understand differences between nonprofit and for-profit organizations. It's important for funders, especially corporations and individuals, to understand how they differ in terms of funding, reserves, spending, etc. Spend more if you can, reduce restrictions, move quickly. Philanthropy can seize this moment to look at their support differently. This includes making loans instead of grants, or supporting loan loss reserve funds at banks and credit unions. Target resources to benefit the communities hardest hit by COVID-19. They are most likely communities who had the least prior to the outbreak. As our panelists have shared, there will be ongoing needs to assist with recovery efforts over an uncertain length of time. CDP and its partners at Candid are tracking philanthropic donations to this outbreak. As of May 20th, the total donations received stood at over $10.7 billion. CDP has many resources devoted to disaster philanthropy that can assist you, including our COVID-19 Response Fund, and our staff is always available to provide guidance. You can find more information about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. To those of you who may be planning disaster response funding, CDP has additional information in our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook. You can find this resource at disasterplaybook.org. And this webinar is part of a series of webinars taking place the second and fourth Tuesday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern through July 14th. The next webinar is on June 9th, and the topic will be COVID-19, grant making to support children and older adults. In order to respect everyone's time and to keep this to an hour, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you to Ruth and Aaron for taking time to share their insights. Special thanks again to the Humana Foundation for partnering with us on this webinar, and to our co-sponsors, Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Council on Foundation, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, Grantmakers in Health, Grantmakers in Aging, United Philanthropy Forum, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. As the webinar ends, a brief survey will pop up. please take a moment to share your thoughts with us. If you have questions that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to me at sally.ray@disasterphilanthropy.org, or you can look for the response in our follow-up after this webinar is over. Thank you, stay healthy, and have a good afternoon.